Hi, the Hazara people have a long history of persecution in Afghanistan. They are the most persecuted ethnic group in Afghanistan and are amongst the most persecuted ethnic groups in the world. Hazaras also form one of the largest group of asylum seekers and refugees. In the 2001 Bonn Agreement, which determined governing arrangements in Afghanistan following the preliminary defeat of the Taliban by US forces, statistics indicated that Hazaras comprised 19% of the total population. Sanctioned state persecution, discrimination and exclusion against the Hazaras began in the late 19th century. When the Pashtun ruler at the time, Amir Abdul Rahman, brought the region's many different communities under a centralized authority, he identified the Hazaras as a threat to the ethnic Pashtun dominance. Rahman incited religious and ethnic hatred to conquer them in a series of exceptionally brutal wars. He instigated a jihad against Hazaras, seen as infidels due to their links to Shia Islam in a predominantly Sunni Muslim state. Some 60% of the Hazara population were killed, sold into slavery or forced into exile. Rahman committed ethnic cleansing and war crimes against the people of Hazarajat, Afghanistan's central mainland, when remapping Afghanistan's social geography in favour of the ruling Pashtun tribes. During his brutal reign, the Emir confiscated the lands and properties of Hazaras and generously distributed them amongst Pashtun tribes. To depopulate the Hazarajat region, the government issued firmans or royal decrees that authorised Pashtun nomads or Kuchis to take Hazaras' land and their livestock by force. This created a special political identity and protection system for Kuchis. The Kuchis were used as mercenaries of the state against the so-called Hazara rebellion in central Afghanistan. Victorious Amir Abdul Rahman Khan claimed that Afghans saw Hazaras as enemies of their country and their religion, which lay the foundation for Hazaras' ongoing persecution, exclusion and discrimination by the country's dominant groups. The Emir's actions established a pattern in which successive governments marginalized Hazaras for much of the 19th and 20th century. Hazaras were forced to conceal their identities in order to obtain identification documents during the monarchy from 1929 onward, when the process of Pashtunization was underway. Until the 1970s, Afghan law barred Hazaras from holding office, enrolling in universities, or holding any position of national authority in the government. Hazaras are still being attacked and killed to this day. Their homes are burnt or taken away from them, and Pashtun Kuchis still claim annual land rights, all as a legacy of the decrees. The scope and frequency of intrusions into the Hazaras' main homelands in central Afghanistan over the recent decades are the definition of ethnic cleansing and genocide. In the 1990s, the Taliban starved thousands of Hazaras to death by blocking their food supplies. The Taliban's 1998 massacre of over 2,000 Hazaras in just 3 days in Mazar-e-Sharif remains one of the most notorious atrocities in Afghanistan's 40-year-long conflict. Hazara groups estimate that 15,000 of their people died in orchestrated killings under the Taliban, which in turn became the trigger for major refugee flows in neighbouring countries and to Europe and Australia. The Taliban went from house to house searching for Hazaras and then gunned them down in front of their families or slit their throats. Others were executed by firing squads or crammed into tractor trailers where they sweltered in the summer sun. During these mass killings, the Taliban presented 3 options to the Hazaras: become Sunni Muslim, leave Afghanistan, or risk being killed. This spate of massacres were described as genocidal in its ferocity. Since 2007, hundreds of Hazaras have been shot, beheaded, abducted in various districts across Afghanistan, leaving these people desperate to defend themselves in the absence of government protection. The existential threats against Hazaras forced figures like Abdul Ghani Alipur to take arms and attempt to protect the Hazaras, who considered him their last resort of hope for their security and protection in facing growing threats from the Taliban and former government forces. In the aftermath of atrocities committed against Hazaras, particularly when the former government forces were unable and unwilling to offer help, former government officials and spokespersons often employed the blame frame to justify the killing of Hazara civilians by using labels such as the enemy of the state, union breakers, spies of Iran, and affiliates to the Fatimiyun to demonize the victims and to justify police brutality. No other group or population were met with the same fate as the Hazara people. Hate speech against Hazaras and dehumanization remains rife. Popular derogatory terms marginalize Hazaras at best as outsiders and at worst as animals. Hazaras largely speak the Hazaragi and Dari languages. This linguistic distinction, along with their Turk-Mongolian heritage and Asiatic features, have set them apart from other ethnic groups in the country, such as the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and the Pashtuns. They have been subjected to shallow, racist stereotypes that portray them as a lower caste. An extremist Afghan activist and journalist, followed by more than 50,000 people online, tweeted on the 2nd of July 2021. The young Hazara generation must be really careful. Foreigners' support won't last forever. You won't be able to keep conspiring with their help against the great Pashtun people. For 19 years, you've slaughtered Pashtun with the help of NATO and the United States. This is enough. Tweeting is threatening language. We must not forget that genocide cannot happen without the connivance of society. Certain ways of thinking, prejudices, and power dynamics must already exist for genocide to occur. Dehumanizing language always precedes genocide, whether against Jewish people in Europe in the 1930s or against Tutsis in Rwanda in the lead up to 1994. Hazaras are confronted regularly with hundreds of tweets employing genocidal rhetoric against them. They have survived genocidal acts before, but may be threatened once again, now that the Taliban have resumed the rule of Afghanistan. Institutional hostility, underrepresentation in senior government positions, and discrimination from Afghanistan's dominant ethnic groups are all still impacting the lives of Hazaras. Within the political leadership, from the top down, there is sorry culture of discrimination against Hazaras. The government, in a cynical calculation, has decided Hazara lives are cheap. In the process of state building in the last 2 decades, international aid has been intentionally directed away from the predominantly Hazara region in Afghanistan. In many Hazara regions, there is a minimal access to electricity, essential services, running water, or even basic infrastructure. In winter, much of the population of Hazara areas are trapped in the mountainous region, and many die simply from the lack of food, cold, and other effects of their abject poverty. Firstly, Hazaras have been targeted by virtue of their distinctive ethnic origins and identity. They have Turk-Mongolian heritage, and their distinct Asiatic features typically include a relatively flat nose, broader face, and narrow eyes. This sets them apart from other ethnic groups such as the ethnic Tajiks and Pashtuns in Afghanistan. The Taliban, who are mainly ethnic Pashtuns, have a saying about Afghanistan's non-Pashtun ethnic groups. This goes Tajiks to Tajikistan, Uzbeks to Uzbekistan, and Hazaras to Goristan. Goristan being the Pashto word for cemetery. Secondly, Hazaras have been targeted on the basis of perceived religious affiliation. Hazaras are predominantly Shia Muslims, while the majority of population in Hazara are Sunni Muslims. Hazaras are despised by Sunni Muslim radicals such as the Islamic State group and the Taliban, and are also discriminated against by Afghan institutions. With that said, Hazaras are not a homogeneous collective. There are atheists, secular, Shia, Ismaili, and Sunni Hazaras as well. Thirdly, more recently, Hazaras have been targeted over their hard-earned success in education, sports, and politics, and for their progressive and democratic ideas. Hazara culture promotes democratic values of social liberalism and progressive thinking, and the community has embraced expanded educational opportunities. Hazaras are the main ethnic group that have challenged and threatened the religious conservative views, the extremism, nepotism, and ethnic favoritism, which is ingrained both within Afghan society and the government. There has been a repeated failure of journalists and media outlets in recent years to identify the ethnic identity of Hazara victims when they report on this genocidal violence. By doing so, they overlook the central fact that Hazaras are systemically targeted for their ethnic identity. On Saturday, the 8th of May 2021, in Dashtabarchi, a predominantly Hazara-populated area of Kabul, a bomb attack killed more than 85 Hazara school children, primarily girls and wounded at least 147 others. The students killed were not simply murdered for going to school or for being Afghan, but for being Hazara. Despite the attack specifically targeting members of the Hazara community, in particular schoolgirls, media reports do not mention the identity of the victims as Hazaras, even though the Taliban or ISIS only target one community in the country based on their ethnicity and religion. This is despite the fact that the attack took place in a Hazara neighbourhood, the target of the attack were the Hazara community, and all the victims were Hazara. If one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew, wrote Hannah Arendt. There are Afghan ethno-nationalists whose comments can be classified as hate speech against Hazaras, and media outlets such as BBC News, whose reporting obscures the fact that the victims of attacks are Hazaras and instead saying Afghans have been attacked, or in recent cases, coal miners or university students. The attack on the Halo Trust coal miners illustrates a distinct type of attack on Hazaras, where they were identified, selected and separated from non-Hazara Afghans and then killed. The Halo Trust has said that the attack was ethnically motivated and that the attackers were seeking Hazaras as their targets. The CEO said many of the young girls who died last night were Hazara in a statement on the 9th of June 2021. Yet this was not reflected in the reporting. Hazaras are specifically identified, separated from others, selected and brutally killed when attacks occurred, while others from different ethnic groups are spared and left alone. For instance, failing to mention that the victims are Hazaras is akin to saying a police officer in New York shot a man without mentioning the victim's identity as African American. This misleads readers into thinking that the violence is random, chaotic, and not targeted. The hashtag Stop Hazara Genocide Twitter campaign and advocacy against the systemic persecution of Hazara does not mean ignoring the killing of others in the country. However, non-Hazara Afghans are not targeted for their specific ethnic identity. Journalist Maija Luuto wrote on Twitter on May the 9th of 2021, "Extremely concerning. When I was based in Afghanistan, I noticed many people didn't want journalists to highlight the fact that Hazaras were being targeted. A former security official openly tweeted asking reporters to write about Afghans being the victims instead of Hazaras. When Hazaras attempt to raise awareness about being systemically discriminated against and persecuted in Afghanistan due to their ethnic identity and demand justice and equality for their community, they often encounter a major backlash from members of the government and non-Hazaras. Members of the former Afghan government and spokesperson often accuse Hazara protests of equality as being backed by Iran merely because the majority of Hazaras of Afghanistan are Shia Muslims, which is also the official state religion in Iran. However, the relationship between Iran and the Hazara Shia population in Afghanistan does not go beyond a shared religious tradition. While all Afghans suffer from the conflict and unrest in Afghanistan, this should not obscure the reality that Hazaras are systematically targeted due to their ethnicity. Acknowledging this does not undermine the fact that all ethnic groups in Afghanistan are victims of war. When Hazaras raise awareness about their plight, they do not do this as a competition in terms of victimhood and suffering. It is of utmost importance that Afghans empathize with each other, accept each other's distinctive plights, and allow for a healing process to prevail. Showing empathy and acknowledging the pain of Hazaras is not a zero-sum game. It will lead to more understanding and greater compassion among different communities in Afghanistan and around the world. It is important to acknowledge the identity of victims of these types of barbaric attacks, as mentioning this recognizes the pattern of violence behind them. The labels and sentiments used to describe the victims are often used to divert political discourse and conceal the real reasons behind the violence. Therefore, it is essential to call these attacks what they are: ethnically motivated attacks against Hazaras, a community that is subject to institutional oppression, marginalization, persecution, massacres, and at risk of genocide. The Hazara people in Afghanistan fear another genocide at the hands of the Taliban upon the militant group's return to power. Genocide has a very specific meaning within international law. The 1948 Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, an ethnic, racial, or religious group. In light of Articles 2 and 3 of the Convention, the targeted killings of Hazara members, a Shia minority in a Sunni majority state, throughout the history of Afghanistan, constitutes genocide. Their newborn babies, pregnant mothers, school children, girls and youth are consistently attacked and persecuted, not only in recent years, but since the insurrection of Hazara Genocide in the 1880s. Kabul, Afghanistan has an approximate population of 6 million people. West Kabul is predominantly home to 1.6 million Hazaras. Against a backdrop of mounting violence and humanitarian crisis unfolding in the country now, and the return of the Taliban, the cycle of targeted killings of the Hazara people is a deliberate act with the intent to destroy the entire ethnic group, which constitutes genocide. These attacks are routinely carried out against the Hazara community. Therefore, it is important to call these attacks what they are, an ethnically and religiously motivated attack on the Hazaras, who is subject to institutional oppression, marginalisation and consistent systemic persecution, massacres as well as murder. One thing is clear, the former Afghan government neglected the Hazaras and was not ready or willing to protect the community, not even in the capital, Kabul. The genocide of the Hazaras must be recognised. The broad UN definition of genocide can be satisfied even though a superficial analysis of continued attacks against the community. While the element of intent can be legally difficult to prove, this task becomes much easier when prominent leaders and authority figures within the Taliban structure openly calls for the killings of Hazaras. Intent is clearly evident. Genocide is about destruction in whole or in part. Ultimately, we must remember that the people targeted and killed are all human beings. The Hazara people in Afghanistan faced genocidal acts during the regime of the Taliban in the late 1990s, and there are grave fears that Hazaras will be subjected to genocide by the Taliban again. The Hazaras are now at risk once again as potential victims of genocide. Afghanistan's friends in the international community, such as the US, the EU, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Gulf states must provide humanitarian protection to Afghan refugees and all those who face violence, persecution and potential genocide, particularly to Hazara refugees who are potential victims of genocide. As of June 1st, 2021 in Australia, there are about 5,000 refugees from Afghanistan who are on temporary visas. The majority are Hazara asylum seekers and refugees who have been stuck on temporary protection visas for more than 8 years. These people must be given immediate permanent protection and the pathway to family reunification. More than 7,600 Afghan Hazara refugees and asylum seekers, including women and children, are living in Indonesia, and many others have been stranded in Malaysia for many years. Hazara refugees cannot settle in Indonesia and Malaysia as these states are not signatories to the Refugee Convention. They also cannot return to Afghanistan as it remains precarious and unsafe for them to do so, with violence and hostility increasing rapidly. Their resettlement in Australia and New Zealand should be a priority, particularly in this critical time of need. The Australian government and others must follow the UK and Canada and create a special humanitarian program for Afghans who are at high risk of harm by the Taliban, which can include family members of the Hazara community. A similar scheme was established in 2015, where the Australian government allocated an additional 12,000 humanitarian visas to people fleeing the country. Thousands of Afghan refugees are also stranded in Greece and continental Europe. In recent years, the EU has increasingly been deporting Afghan nationals, many of whom are Hazara asylum seekers. The EU, as a promoter of human rights, liberalism and democracy, must acknowledge the humanitarian and political situation on the ground in Afghanistan and provide permanent protection to Afghan refugees. As the security and humanitarian situation worsens in Afghanistan and thousands of Afghans are forced to leave the country in search of safety elsewhere, Friends of Afghanistan at the international level must step up to uphold their humanitarian ideals and values and in turn work to help the Afghan Hazara refugees and those seeking asylum. The UK has created a humanitarian scheme to assist those in urgent need of protection. Other states in the EU must play their part and follow. When the Genocide Convention was approved by the UN, a treaty was born out of the fervent desires to ensure that never again would any person face the horrors of genocide, such as the atrocities inflicted during the Holocaust. To prevent another genocide from taking place, the international community must be alert to the grave concerns of the Hazara people and the possibility of another horrific human catastrophe. We, as global citizens, must play our part to prevent the genocide of the Hazaras by extending our hands in this critical time of need. We must grant protection to those in need, and push our government to act in different capacities to help the people of Afghanistan by honouring their promises under the Genocide Convention. Any failure to address the urgent humanitarian crisis unfolding in Afghanistan and turning our backs on those in Afghanistan who need us most will inevitably cause further violence and lead to a massive, catastrophic humanitarian crisis. To prevent this, I call on you, the people, to join the voiceless men, women and children of Afghanistan who need our support and help in this time of need.